And good afternoon. Charles Moscowitz here. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Monday through Friday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. live streaming on all of our subscribing platforms. Thanks for joining me. And my guest this segment is Jonathan Jakubowski. He is the author of Bellwether Blues, a conservative awakening of the Millennial Soul. Jonathan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Charles. Really great to be on your show. Thanks for the invite.
You're welcome. Listen, this book, and you have taken on what is really a Herculean task, one that involves reaching across this divide that we're in this country, especially among people your age, millennials, in terms of reaching people on the other side, on the so-called liberal side. And I don't know how you did it. You talk about in this book 6 examples of people who became more conservative as a result of talking with you and others. Wood County, Ohio, you say 6 people changed their voting preferences from liberal to conservative. So really, if you can figure this one out, you'll get a Nobel Prize. How do you do it?
Well, thanks, Charles. I looked at empirical evidence, and the empirical evidence, there's 3 parts to the book. The Bellwether Blues, part 1 looks at how the left has left the left, and they've gone so far away that they've abandoned the ideals of freedom. The Democrats of the 1980s would have stood for the First Amendment. The Democrats of today, not even close. And there's a whole subset of millennials. It's a large generation. I investigate the generation, the largest in America, but it's very nuanced. And the millennials on the coast, New York, California millennials are different from Ohio millennials. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of mainland millennials who might have more in common with us, conservative views, especially around freedom, than we probably think. So I go into swing county America, which is where the votes really count. Thankfully, we still have an electoral college, and the votes of states like Ohio still matter. And in those states, when you look at the values that millennials embrace, and by the way, the millennial generation was born between 1981 and 1996, so they're about 23 to 38 years of age. One misconception is that all millennials are on college campuses. They're actually now moving out of college campuses and into everyday life. They're moving into the economy. They're growing families. They're starting to mature.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Charles.
No, so it's more of a middle American, not so much where I am here in Boston, where people are much more difficult to reach. It's become much harder and much more hidebound, if you will. I guess that, it sounds like your approach is very rational, but we're not always talking about rational people here. It's all based on this emotionally driven idea that they're willing to accept a lot of falsehoods and lies about anybody that doesn't genuflect in their direction.
Yeah, nobody rejects the fact that millennials have been educated in a specific direction, indoctrinated with certain ideals that come from the left for a long time. Their social media sources, the papers they read, the information they receive, the peer pressure that they have certainly comes from left of center, but I argue it's less so in mainland America. And what I found in my county, you mentioned it earlier, Wood County, Ohio, it's a swing county, one of 59 of 3,142 that followed the voting pattern as having voted for Bush in 2000 and 2004, Obama in 2008 and 2012, and then Trump in 2016. So very unique, but an ideal location for understanding what makes voters tick, what makes them swing, what causes their patterns to shift. And my county, which is one of 3 in the state of Ohio, we have 88 counties. There were only 3 that followed that pattern. We are the youngest in terms of our age. We're about 40, I think average of 40 years of age. So within my county, there was a whole number of millennials in the 2016 election that at one time voted for Obama and then changed their votes to Trump. They didn't just go from the left to the middle, as I think most millennials are feeling kind of skeptical, disillusioned, frustrated. They really don't trust political institutions, and that abandonment of the left from classical liberalism kind of leaves them there, but neither are they yet willing to embrace conservative values. That's why I say they have the Bellwether Blues. That's where the title comes from. They're very frustrated by it. But there were millennials in swing county America that did make that shift, and that's why I look into their lives. And I have 7 stories of millennials. I looked at what caused them to go all the way from left to the right, and then I analyzed that. And in part 3 of the book, the last part of the book, I give a critique to modern methods of conservative persuasion, because those stories inform us of the most influential ways, the most persuasive ways of, as I use in the subtitle, awakening the millennial soul.
Well, let's talk about how it is that they shifted from the left to the right. I mean, just briefly, in my own story, I shifted from the left to the right in the 1980s. And there were two things that caused it. The first one was when I filed my first tax return as a self-employed businessman.
Right.
And I was like, holy mackerel. I mean, the amount was double what I thought it was going to be. And I'm like,
Hmm.
I was happy to pay taxes. I felt patriotic. I was in, let's do this. This country's given a lot to me. And then when by the time the accountant finished adding in all of the extra things and the Social Security and this, that, and the other thing, the amount was more than I had. I would have, I was planning on investing in the company, and I could not do that.
Mm.
And that was an awakening for me. It made me question, what is it that the government is doing with
Right.
all this money?
Hmm.
How is it? It's so regressive to pull this money out of a company that could expand and hire people and create. And so therefore, I want to know what they're doing with the money. And that led me on the road to conservatism. The other
Right.
thing was belief in God.
Yeah.
I guess that my question for you is, what, in a nutshell, did you find were the kind of the pivotal points that led someone to an awakening when they started to realize that they were not part of something that they thought they were part of?
Hmm. Yeah, and I had many options. There were a lot of millennials that fit this profile in my county that I could have interviewed, but I specifically identified 7 millennials with different backgrounds and different stories. Their stories were very, very different in the way that they got to where they were, what led them to change their voting patterns, what was the issue or the principle that really drove them to make that shift. But there was one common element that I found that was consistent throughout all 7 stories. And it was the investment of a mentor who stepped into their life and helped them understand and synthesize the things that they were seeing in life as they started growing families. This is why conservative principles make a difference in helping the next generation experience freedom. Or in the case of an individual that was a socialist, he was voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary of 2016. He had a veteran that stepped into his life and helped him walk through why socialism is a perverse disease and why it's dangerous for the future of America. And in 6 months, he changed his vote all the way over to vote for President Trump. So the one thing I saw was authentic relationship with an individual that they could trust, allowed them to bring the walls down, the barriers down that you don't naturally have in a social media conversation. When I send a tweet or post to somebody, the guard's up. But when I have an authentic relationship and a dialogue with them, there's a lot more trust and they're willing to hear me out. And that was the common thread for the 7 stories in Bellwether Blues.
It's a very tricky business to talk with someone who is a liberal, though, and gain, even when you do gain their trust, because there are all these little triggers. I mean, I can speak to this even talking to certain members of my own family who, everything, all you care about your politics, you have an agenda. And you have to be very, very, you have to tread very carefully and oftentimes not say anything, but just sort of lead by example and lead. You don't have to kind of throw the whole kitchen sink out there. You kind of get into things around the edges and you sort of, create a general atmosphere that might lead to some revelation on their part.
Yeah, that's a great point. I talk about in part 3 the principles of developing and cultivating authentic relationship. And the first principle is you got to listen well. You got to step out, build that relationship with somebody and listen really well and ask great questions. And as you cultivate that relationship, and let's face it, I mean, millennials every day, we're faced with these computer screens, phones. We're being inundated with information that comes from non-personal contacts. So I think this generation, more than any other, really craves authentic relationship. And for somebody to step into my life as a millennial and say, hey, I care about you. I want to take you out to coffee and just cultivate a relationship, invest into your life. That's really unusual.
That's
That is a
huge.
very unique ask. And if they listen to me and hear me talk about my dreams and my goals and ambitions, I'm going to be very interested in hearing what they have to say about their life and their principles and what they believe in and what made them successful.
Now, I think that the biggest calling card of the left is the fact that they control the cultural high ground. They control the entertainment world, and they control, and they're fashionable, and everybody wants to be part of the beautiful people. It's easy, and there's a subtle side to that, a darker side, which pressures you to do it, because if you don't do it, you can see that people are going to be punished. They'll
Mm-hmm.
hold up a conservative. I mean, even recently, this football college coach was outed as a Trump supporter, and his response was "kiss my ass." Sort of like, yeah, that's right. I'm a Trump supporter. To me, that moment might be the beginning of the straw that breaks the camel's back. And he stood up and said, "You're right, I am." But the punishment and the penalty
Mm-hmm.
of being a conservative, not to mention a Trump supporter, is
Mm-hmm.
very, very severe. So most people keep their heads low. They don't want to have that kind of trouble, and for good reason. You want to have a career. You want to get ahead professionally. You don't want to, bring attention to yourself. I mean, in business, a good business generally tries to avoid negative attention. So, there's a lot of incentive to sort of stay on the left and not think about it too much, but do it because you're immediately accepted. You immediately get rewards and accolades and friendship and dates and everything else. And by rejecting it, you're immediately punished. This is their main calling card. How can we overcome that?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I'm not going to deny that. And in fact, the book is not saying or making. I don't make the argument in Bellwether Blues that we need to abandon speaking on public platforms. Not in the slightest. That we need more voices that are declaring the truth and helping to communicate why conservative principles are persuasive and compassionate, and why they make a great difference in future generations. What I'm arguing for the points that you just made is a lot of these individuals really don't have a passionate interest in mainland America and swing counting America, going out and marching and pulling down statues and being engaged in the radical left. That doesn't interest them. And I think there's even a level of fear when they see defunding of the police, for example, with the examples across our country that are now very commonplace. But you have to have somebody that can help thread the needle, can help explain why that ideology comes from a specific worldview and a specific political ideology that is seeking power. And if we can help them tie those principles together and explain why a limited vision of government, one that does what it's supposed to do in creating defense, common defense is one of the words in the preamble to the Constitution, but all of the principles of government remain limited so that we can, as individual citizens, have enough freedom to flourish. And the word freedom, I think, is a major value that millennials share with conservatives.
Oh, absolutely. That's a common denominator. And Jonathan, they're going to use emotional tactics to galvanize people. And of course, the big one right now is systemic racism. And I think that there's, rather than leave the field open to those who make that charge and whose answer to such things as racism is to rip the blackface off the pancake box, you can then say, look, conservatives, we actually believe the best way to address things like racism is creating a business atmosphere in the minority community where people can make some money by deregulate, by creating the right regulations and lowering taxes and maybe addressing crime problems so people could get to work without worrying about getting caught across a drug gang crossfire, improving the schools. I mean, President Trump mentioned it in Tulsa, school choice for these rotten big city schools. If someone can get out of those schools and get into a charter school or a private school and someone gets a tax credit for sponsoring them, then that goes a long way toward ameliorating race division and race conflict. A lot of things like that. In other words, I think conservatives can address this positively and maybe subtly point the finger the other way and say who is really responsible for promoting racist policies that hurt black people, that hurt minorities in this country. So I don't know. That's my approach. What say you?
Yeah, I agree with you. And Charles, I found myself a couple of weeks ago in Minneapolis, Minnesota at Ground Zero with a group of leaders who wanted to understand a fact-finding trip, wanted to understand what was it that led to the George Floyd killing and the subsequent events. And what I really learned from that experience is I need to be a counter narrative with my life. I need to step into this situation and explain why what the left is saying, there's a political agenda tied to it. Either you're an ally or an enemy. And only being an ally means I have to use their vocabulary. I have to believe their ideology. I have to tear down statues. I have to be woke in the streets. Like that's the only option that they give to anybody else that's out here in mainland America asking the question, what can I do to make an impact? And that is a false choice. There is a third option, and that third option is making friends. It's going out of our way, similar to the principles I talk about with cultivating relationship, authentic relationship, going into these places and working with individuals who are leaders. And I saw the Black Church, for example, as one great medium for helping to develop relational opportunities, transform generations. And by the way, I recognize that the forms of government that have led to the generational destruction of a race. And there's one chapter in my book where we talk about this, what welfare has done to create generational poverty. That comes from the left. Like our vision of government, of limited government, coupled with the institutions that are further upstream, which really matter, faith, family, and freedom, churches, families, nonprofit institutions engaged in helping to cultivate a better life, a better foundation for individuals with a government that's going to defend the right of individuals. That's going to lead to long-term flourishing for the citizens in our nation that are in most abject poverty.
No, I absolutely. And I think that you make an appeal directly to someone who is graduating from college and looking for a job and looking for an opportunity and, is really like, in a sense, ultimately, it's an appeal to self-interest because that's, in a sense, in the broad sense, an appeal to a national interest. All right, Jonathan, you are leading an innovative startup called Smart Solve. What's it about?
Well, it's an organization that's committed to sustainable packaging. I find very few conservatives in this space, but once again, this is just a counter narrative to what most people, when they talk about sustainability, they think it needs to be government intervention with heavy-handed regulation. I don't believe that. I think the private sector is the best way to create innovation, to develop new technology that will be able to allow us to take care of the earth and to advance a lot of the concepts that, the reason why packaging was created to be so unsustainable, if you would, was to enhance shelf life, to allow us to have more food for more people for a longer period of time, to reduce things like starvation. So we have to find a way to make sure that we're bringing technologies to the marketplace that allow that shelf life to remain while making the technology more biodegradable. So that's what our company is really focused on is biodegradable, bio-based packaging.
Oh, that's amazing because, usually conservatives are given this false rap of not being green, which, I tend to be more green. I want to see, less air pollution, less water pollution, putting aside global warming. That's a separate question. We can all agree that we want less air pollution and, certainly better quality of that which we consume. So, in a way, emphasizing that is very positive, and also contrasting that with a left who believes in, the Gaia principle and pristine nature and, without man and this kind of like super overregulation. There's a balance. We want to have advancement in our industrial civilization, and at the same time balance, a clean environment. We're not perfectionists. The left wants to be purist, and they have to have this perfectibility because that's the core of their belief anyway, the perfectibility of man, which is not possible. So
the utopia concept.
Exactly. Now you're also the head of or you're involved with the Wood County Republican Party, and I assume in that capacity, you are supporting the re-election of President Trump. What do you think is going on with that? It's when I look at the polls right now, I feel really my heart sinks. I don't know if I believe them. I actually don't believe them, but you just have to wonder. The day after day, this barrage of negative stories. Every time you turn on the news, the Tulsa speech was this incredible speech. Anyone who watched it on Fox knows that, and yet the only thing that's covered is that he didn't get the big enough crowd, which of course, never mind, they were criticizing him before the speech for calling for too big a crowd. And it's all this incredibly negative view. They never will say something positive. So I guess my question to you is, how do you think that this can be overcome? Do you think President Trump can kind of break through this wall of negativity and reach people?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say is, the 2016 election, I think they gave President Trump in November like a 20% probability of winning. I think the example given by the New York Times was will be harder for Hillary to lose than for an NFL kicker to miss like a 37-yard field goal. I think that was the analogy percentage-wise. Reminding everybody that the polling then obviously they basically crowned her queen before the election day. They were already practicing the ceremony for her victory, right? So I don't necessarily trust polling entirely. I don't think we can. We've seen so many flawed polls And there's a reason why I think some of the polling numbers aren't going to make sense and resonate in swing states throughout the country, because there's a lot of people who don't answer those polls honestly. I talk about Jeremy Harpel in my one of the chapters in Bellwether Blues. And in his story, he specifically outlines within kind of the blue collar segment, they really pride themselves on making sure that pollsters think they're going to vote one way and they vote another way. So there's definitely anecdotal evidence there, and certainly empirical evidence from what happened in the 2016 election as to why I don't think we should trust polls. Having said that, Charles, I agree with you. Like, this is not going to be a runaway race. It's going to be a close and a very tight race. And most of the stories of people that I talked to, they're not, and the people that voted for him in 2016, they weren't really big fans of President Trump. His personality, his history, there were a lot of concerns related to character. And this is where I think the message of Bellwether Blues matters so much. What awakened these voters to vote for him, in spite of their concerns of his character or his persona or his communication, was they saw they stood for principles that they believed for generations to come were going to make a positive impact on their children and on their communities. And they decided to choose principle over personality. And that's really when the Republican Party has been at its best. We go back to 1854 of the founding of the Republican Party, which was built on the idea of abolishing slavery. When the party has been focused on principles, that is when it has flourished the most and made the greatest impacts in our nation.
Well, all I can say is hear, hear. I hope that the party does step up. I'd like to see them do a little bit more nationally. Something that came to my attention recently is that there are a lot more black candidates for the Congress this year that are Republican than Democrat. And I hope that the Republican Party can support them with a lot more effort than they're doing. I mean, that's my main criticism of that. Jonathan Jakubowski, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. Let's stay in touch. I hope that you, continue with your efforts of organizing and, to my way of thinking, you and linking up with other people across the country is what's going to pull this thing through. So Bellwether Blues is the book. Bellwether Blues, A Conservative Awakening of the Millennial Soul, available at Amazon.com. There you go. Excellent. Jonathan, thanks again for joining me this afternoon.
Charles, thanks so much. I really appreciated the invite and really glad to be on.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You too.